The longest.
It is a long minute. It's like watching, like, try to be on time. Good afternoon. At this time, I'll call our City Council work session to order. We have one item in open session. That is a 2023 legislative update. Mr. Manager, please provide an overview.
Yes, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council, as you recall at your June 5th meeting, the City Attorney's Office provided an overview on new legislation which had a potential impact to the city. This afternoon, we have Mindy Carlin and Emily Reynolds of Access Point, the city legislative liaisons, who will provide City Council a review of the 2023 legislative session and review the city's legislative agenda of initiatives. Mindy, Emily, good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's great to be with all of you. Again, as a refresher, my name is Emily Reynolds. I'm the Vice President at Access Point Public Affairs, and then accompanied by Mindy Carlin, who is our President and co-founder of Access Point. It's been another great year representing the city of Suffolk at the General Assembly session, and we will have a number of slides that we'll go over that kind of highlights everything that we were monitoring throughout the session. And as a session recap, you'll see on here the 2023 regular General Assembly session convened on January 11th, 2023. It was a short session, meaning the legislature had 46 days to act on all legislation and then amend that fiscal year 2022 to 2024 budget. There were 2,863 bills and resolutions that were introduced, of which 1,687 were passed by both the House and the Senate, so a lot of monitoring on our part, that's for sure. We adjourned sine die on February 25th, where they adjourned without agreement on a comprehensive budget and instead adopted a skinny budget that Mindy will highlight further in our presentation and kind of go over those and where we sit now. Finally, reconvene, or the veto session, convened on April 12th, where the governor's actions on legislation passed in the regular session. They were considered in the skinny budget amendments, and then as well as they had 4 additional governor's amendments, again, that Mindy's going to go over in just a little bit. So you'll notice our legislation highlights revolve around the Suffolk City legislative initiatives and priorities that you all adopted, and that's transportation, public safety, taxes, regulations, community development and planning, environment, utilities, and then budget priorities. So the first item is related to transportation. Our goal going into this session was to obtain $30.1 million to fund right-of-way acquisition and utility relocation for the Route 460 corridor infrastructure improvement project, mouthful. The bipartisan legislation that was passed and signed by the governor allows a mechanism for a project like ours to secure funding through an existing transportation partnership opportunity fund once approved through the application process. This legislation created a new mechanism and a current funding source to support infrastructure that's needed for major economic development projects like this one. I will say, actually, our project was a poster child throughout session and used as a common example when the legislation was being proposed. Being that other funding sources are not an option for us, this expands that Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund and then allows for funding of projects that meet that code criteria. While I mentioned that the legislation passed, which was a huge, huge win, the funding stream is still contingent upon the budget and the passage of that amendment to the budget. So I will say what we're looking at, the governor and the House had the exact same funding request. So it was $100 million transferred from the Virginia Transportation Infrastructure Bank, and then $200 million from the CTB. And then you look at the Senate, and this is where they will have to come to a compromise. And this is where they would maintain $100 million transferred from the Virginia Transportation Infrastructure Bank recommended, but then also the difference would lie in from what would be transferred from the CTB, and that's $100 million. So you're looking at either $300 million or $200 million, and that's what's in limbo right now. So I will say that the CTB, the Commonwealth Transportation Board, has already adopted the guidelines and criteria from this legislation that was passed for use in considering these projects for TPOF. And I know that Suffolk is preparing our application for this process. We've been able to obtain letters of support, which is great, from federal, state, elected officials, chamber, TPO, so making a lot of progress there. And Mindy, I'll pass it along if you want to add to anything, and then she's going to take us into public safety.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. As Emily said, Mr. Mayor, I'm Mindy Carlin, Vice President of Access Point, really pleased to be here. So talking about a few of the public safety priorities, our goal with respect to sovereign immunity was basically to protect it. We had one piece of legislation that was introduced that would have threatened that it's okay.
Tornado, what stops us?
No, nothing at all, no. So thankfully, we were able to stop this legislation from proceeding, which would have waived sovereign immunity for healthcare employees, healthcare providers that are employed by localities at local or regional correction facilities. So this legislation failed. There was a tie vote in the Senate on it. Fortunately, the Lieutenant Governor broke that in the direction that we wanted. Next slide. So I know that it's a significant priority to the city to try to diminish the impact of TDOs and ECOs on our local law enforcement. So there were two pieces of legislation in addition to some budget items I'll talk about a little bit later. The first one expands the ability to use alternative TDO transportation. So we were very proud, pleased to support this legislation that passed and was signed by the governor that requires magistrates to authorize alternative transportation if certain conditions are met. Next slide. There was also legislation that impacted how TDOs are handled when intoxication is involved, and basically allows those TDOs to take place in a hospital emergency department, again, if certain conditions are in place, providing the relief from law enforcement having to sit with a person and to move them to an alternative location for the TDO. Next slide. We also talked in our legislative agenda about how we could support additional flexibility for retired law enforcement officials. Particularly, we talked about school resource officers, and we know that one of the significant barriers to them being able to do serve in those types of roles is the impact on VRS. And so we were pleased to support Senator Cosgrove's legislation that reduces from 12 to 6 months the required break-in service for a retired law enforcement official, and that legislation was passed and signed by the governor. This did have a later enactment date. It did not go into effect July 1, as most of the legislation does, but it will go into effect January 1. On the same topic, we were supportive of Senate Bill 1411, which Senator Normant introduced, that was also passed, which directs VRS and the Department of Criminal Justice to work with JLARC, which is the state kind of regulatory and audit commission, to look at and report on options for allowing law enforcement officers to return to work after retirement and be able to continue to receive their benefits. So another evaluation of how to manage that in a way that can protect the pensions, but also ensure that the funding is there to support those pensions. Mental health, so in addition to wanting additional supports for our public safety officials who have to deal with individuals experiencing a mental health emergency, we also wanted to be supportive and identify strategies to increase mental health support for our law enforcement officials. And so we we followed and legislation that was introduced by Senator Bill DeSteff that adds to the items that are compensable under workers' comp, the anxiety order and depressive orders. And so it aligns those with how post-traumatic PTSD is treated. And we monitored that legislation, which was passed and signed by the governor. In addition, we worked on legislation, we worked to oppose legislation to ensure that the inmate fees that are charged at the regional jails were not changed because that financial burden would then shift to the localities that are responsible for regional jails, which Suffolk is one. So legislation was introduced that would have eliminated or capped certain fees that are charged to inmates in local corrections, correctional authorities, and this obviously would have been very concerning to us without any way to replace that revenue. So we opposed this legislation, and it failed at the committee level on a 5-11 vote.
So moving to the next legislative priority item, and that was finance regulations. Our goal was to protect our existing taxing authority. So there were a number of pieces of legislation we opposed that would have impacted that local taxing authority. Luckily, the bills and resolutions listed here did fail to pass. I did want to highlight the first two that many localities spoke in opposition of. They were House Bill 1484, and the companion bill was Senate Bill 850, as well as Senate Bill 1008. These would have eliminated the local 1% grocery tax, so that was huge. I know VML, VACO chimed in on that one as well, or actually took the lead big time, whereas a lot of the localities joined suit. Moving along, another goal of the cities was to protect and expand the historic preservation tax credit. We were very supportive of Senate Bill 1066 by Senator Surville. It would have increased the maximum amount of historic rehabilitation tax credit that a taxpayer may claim per taxable year from $5 million to $10 million. Unfortunately, this legislation failed to advance in the House Finance Subcommittee. It did pass through the Senate, and it was stopped in the House Finance Sub. We will continue to protect and really work to expand this important tax credit, as we know it's definitely valuable and has benefited the city of Suffolk greatly. So we'll definitely keep our eyes and ears up for that one. Moving along to community development and planning. The first goal was to protect the program to enable the city to seek funding to help maintain historic African American cemeteries. We were very supportive of Senate Bill 1062 and House Bill 2244, Sproul and Cordoza. This expands flexibility in the Department of Historic Resources, appropriating funds based on this expanded criteria. So the legislation was passed, became law July 1, 2023, which I know the city attorney covered in his presentation, which was great to see this one pass. The next community development and planning priority was to increase flexibility and public notice requirements to reduce the cost of the city, but also maintaining that transparency regarding city action. We know that's very important. We were supportive of this legislation, which was passed. It was made effective July 1, 2023, which I know that the city attorney also covered in his briefing to you all, so I won't go into extreme detail, but this legislation increases the city's flexibility in this public notice requirements, which is always a win to have that flexibility at the local level. All right. I think I skipped. Yeah, there we go. All right. The next one is environmental utility. Sorry about that. And this is the funding and other support to assist. This is in regards to the funding for electric charging stations. Unfortunately, all of these bills listed failed to advance. However, with the increase in purchases of electric vehicles comes the need for infrastructure down the road, no pun intended. So we can definitely expect to see more legislation come through with this. But of course, our goal is to obtain funding and other support to assist with this important priority as we move forward. And with that, I will pass it along to Mindy. She's going to give the budget recap.
Thank you, Emily. So to highlight, as Emily mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, the skinny budget included four four key priorities. The first one is funding for state education programs. So it included $115.9 million for FY23, $125.8 in general fund for FY24 to deal with the adjustments the technical adjustments that happen year over year and flow through the school systems, or flow through the localities to the schools. So they ensured that funding was included as a budget amendment that passed. They also included in that amendment an additional $16.8 million in general fund for this fiscal year to help those school divisions that were impacted by a calculation tool error that impacted some localities where they didn't receive the funding that they had projected to receive. This, however, did not impact the city of Suffolk. So based on the skinny budget that was adopted and signed by the governor, our K through 12 base funding distribution is $114,612,773 in this fiscal year and $114,909,756 in FY 2024. And any adjustments that need to be made for that will be made moving forward. The three additional items, $904.6 million was deposited into the rainy day fund, AKA Revenue Stabilization Fund. That's the constitutionally required. In addition, $250 million deposit was made to VRS, again required, and an estimated $147 million or so out of that VRS payment was for teacher retirement plans. And then there was another $100 million for FY23 to address cost overruns. So all of those items were included in the budget amendment that passed. In addition, when the legislature came back for the reconvened or veto session, there were four additional amendments that the governor had put forward. So the first included some technical changes to general fund, and these were primarily tied to conformity with the IRS that we go through every year. There was some funding that was allocated for a TANF program for unemployed parents where a certain degree of cash assistance benefits was required. They included $38 million that will enable DMAS, that is actually enabling the Department of Medical Assistance Services and DSS to go through the process to do redeterminations for everyone who is on Medicaid following the end of the public health emergency. And then the last thing that was included and adopted was $43.3 million in short-term low-interest loan for the construction of a facility at J-Labs, pending approval by the U.S. Department of Energy on a project that they are submitting a proposal to provide. So right now, that's kind of the last official action that was taken on the budget. So that was in April. No significant steps have taken since then. There is some discussion that the governor may call for a special session, but there's no confirmation that he will do that. And even if the governor did call a special session, the legislature could come in and then adjourn or recess. So it wouldn't necessarily have the impact of forcing legislators to move forward. An agreement on the budget amendments prior to the end of this calendar year is still possible, but honestly, as time continues to move on, I'm less and less optimistic that it would, that we will have a compromise. I would love to be wrong on that. The governor, regardless, the governor will be proposing his first and only budget in December of this year, which will then be considered by the new legislature that will be elected in November. Highlighting just a few of our budget priorities that are pending because of the impasse with respect to the budget. Emily mentioned the first one, funding for the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund. That's a big one. There are a number of public safety related investments that are listed on the slide. Student Resource Officer Incentive Grant Fund, that was legislation we supported that's contingent on funding. In addition, so while the legislation passed with respect to TDOs and ECOs, there was significant funding that was also included in the governor's budget, the budget supported by the House, and the budget supported by the Senate to actually help fund some of the priorities to minimize that impact on local law enforcement. All of that money, as well as the other money on crisis services, is all held up contingent upon a budget. budget amendments. There's an off-duty officer program, again, varying perspective in the House and the Senate with respect to the amount invested. That's held up. Modernization, I referenced the crisis services as well. That's more than $57 million that is all pending a compromise on the budget. A couple priorities in education. There are a number of things on school construction that are pending. A local option increase in the sales tax of up to 1% for school construction if that is approved by referendum. I know that's something that some of the other localities in Hampton Roads have strongly supported. That's held up, and of course teacher salary increases. There are a few things in community development that we wanted to highlight. There was $5 million allocated in the Senate budget for local libraries in state aid, as well as a $500,000 allocation for food literacy and health education for the Suffolk Foundation. And then we know there have been a couple questions about salary increases for some of the constitutional officers. Those are proposed in the various budgets, but held up in the impasse as well. So our conferees are listed up here just as a reminder. For right now, we continue to be very well situated with respect to Suffolk delegate, or folks that represent the greater city of Suffolk, in Emily Brewer as a conferee on the House side, as well as Tommy Normant and Louise Lucas on the Senate side. I highlighted in yellow those who will not be in their current seats, however, when the legislature convenes in January. So we're going to be looking at a very, very different situation post-November elections. So with that, I'll let Emily wrap us up.
Yeah. I'm just going to close us out. I'll be saying it was a great year with many successes, and a lot of which are highlighted on this slide. Again, passage of legislation to form a mechanism to secure funding for our project. Again, contingent on that budget, we'll reemphasize that, but just to have that mechanism is huge. Protecting sovereign immunity, local taxing authority, funds for African American cemeteries. So again, this is just a high-level overview of a positive year that we've had. But again, it's been a privilege to be able to represent you all down or up there in Richmond. So with that, we'll take any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Council, questions or comments? Councilman Williams?
Yes, thank you. A very, very, very good presentation. I only have one question. Will we be allowed, council, will we get a copy of this presentation so we can take a look at it?
Okay.
Beat me to it. Council, any other questions or comments? Councilman Rector?
Just for clarification purposes, when you were talking about the impact from the sales tax snafu on Suffolk Public Schools, you said that did not impact us. So had we gotten everything that we were, I guess for lack of a better phrase, promised?
Yes, sir. So all of the, what I was referencing was an additional up to 1% sales tax that a locality could authorize that could be spent on school construction. But with respect to operating funds and direct aid from the Commonwealth, all of the regular adjustments based on the sales tax and the wide range of other factors were all addressed in the skinny budget. And so all of that funding has flowed through from the state. Yes, sir.
Did you get that? I didn't get that. Vice Mayor Ward?
Yes, thank you for the presentation, but I just want to know about the African American Cemetery, where we start, how information, like how can we get it done, when it start working. It's there now, so how can we get it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the program is in place, and so I think should the city be in a position where you would like to seek funding to make do some maintenance on an African American cemetery, then the program is in place and an application could be submitted. So you could work with staff to evaluate kind of whether or not there are historical African American cemeteries that are eligible for the program. But our focus at the state level was ensuring that the fund was maintained, that the program was maintained, because that is what provides the flexibility for localities to be able to submit requests.
And to ensure that the language stays flexible, and to expand that. I will say too, I checked online before I came here, and that application is live, and it's a 3-page application, so.
All right, thank you.
Council, any other questions or comments? If not, I've got a few questions. We start with the TPOFs, the 30.1 million. I understand that's part of a $100 million pot of money, if you will. And I believe if there's a threshold of 35 million, so anything under 31 million, is that it's more or less discretionary as far as the governor? Who makes that decision? Is the governor, Secretary of Transportation? Who makes that decision?
Do you want?
Sure. I will just say, and I pulled up this slide so we could see it. So the funding would be allocated for transportation projects that are recommended by Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Commerce and Trade, as well as at the CTB's discretion as well. They would be available.
Okay, and it's at their discretion, I think, if it's under 35 million?
Actually,
Or is it more than that?
right, so there's no cap on the program, and what you can ask for, where the amount kicks in, is if the project needs to go to the MEI commission, and so we are under that threshold,
Correct.
so we would just
So it
need
should be fairly
to
easy.
be eligible and be supported by the CTB. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. So you confirm
Yes,
that.
sir.
And my other question is, we're talking about state funds here. I don't know where we are, working with our federal partners and the port and putting together upcoming possibilities as far as funding from the feds as well.
Right, yes, we are definitely looking at all of the options to help fund this project. For this phase in particular, we are optimistic that with the TPOF amendments in place, that once funding is allocated at the state level, that we will be hopefully selected, and that funding will flow to us. It's delayed, obviously, in the fact that we don't have a budget. Other staff may want to comment in more detail, but we believe if we can fund through this program the right-of-way acquisition and utility relocation, that will position us well for subsequent phases to potentially generate support from other sources, including at the federal level. But other staff may want to comment further if I misspoke.
Senator Kane needs to be reminded he was very, very supportive of that project, so just.
That's always a good idea,
We can
sir.
play it back in case he has amnesia, so.
And I will say
keep that in mind.
that Senator Kane and Senator Warner both offered a letter of support for this particular project
Okay,
in their
well,
application.
that's.
And again, it goes to what she was saying with leverage. I mean, once if you can secure the state funds, it does give us some leverage as we see other
Okay,
funding
well,
opportunities.
it's looking very promising. As you said, I couldn't agree with you more. I started writing down the wins and the losses, and really, we kind of wanted everything that had priority.
Yeah.
Some of them, we didn't, but it wasn't that significant, if you will. The sovereign immunity is huge all the way around. That the alternative TDO transportation, I think if I wrote it down correctly, you said that the magistrates would authorize that. Did they provide any guidelines as to qualifications or what personnel, how they would be qualified to be used in that capacity, or is that left up to the localities?
Yeah, so the legislation does outline the conditions under which a magistrate may order alternative transportation. So we're happy to get more information to you on what those specific conditions are so that you can better understand what that impact could be in Suffolk.
Yeah, well, I'd really like to know what the qualifications are. I'm sure you can't hire anybody off the street, but
Right.
I foresee a lot of these being eventually done by private firms also, being contracted out to handle, those duties, both locally for the jail and also our police department. And anytime we can do that and, allows our officers to be where they need to be, which is on the street. So this is really important.
Right, and the off-duty officer program that I referenced that's held up in the budget is really intended for that purpose.
Yeah, and I'm sure they'd be qualified, having been sworn officers and retired, that wouldn't be an issue, but I can also see it with the need being like it is. I think the need is going to far surpass the number of retired officers that, would like to do that. So I'm just looking down the road and I figure a lot of this could be contracted, so.
And just to clarify, sir, the off-duty officers program, for that, you don't need to be retired. You could be off-duty, and as a way for our current officers to supplement their income is
Okay.
kind of the way that program's structured. But absolutely, I think the need is great, and we want optimum flexibility.
Okay, that's great. The inmate fees, I mean, we talked about with that when it first came up, that had the potential of having a $2 to $3 million effect on our regional jail, even though it didn't seem like that much, because it was not just the income that went away, but it was a service that was being provided at no charge that would have to be replaced with income. So the two collectively were close to $3 million. So I'm glad to see that left. The Historic African American Cemeteries, I saw some community development notices. I think that goes right along with some of the initiatives that we've taken independently as a city to change some of the guidelines that we did as far as planning is concerned in certain cases when projects met a particular threshold. They were no longer voted on the initial meeting. It was another meeting, and this seems to have the same effect as far as providing additional notification in time.
Well, in addition, on that point, Mr. Mayor, if I may, it also will significantly reduce the amount of content that is required to be included in local publications, for example, which is extremely expensive. And so it really, the legislation was a compromise with the Press Association, is how can you find that balance between including content that is relevant to your constituents so that they know what's going to be considered, but not be costing you guys thousands and thousands of dollars in local taxpayer money to have it be all printed in the newspaper. So it really was a significant compromise and move forward that hopefully will cost a good bit, reduce the expenses.
And you'll see that on that second bullet up there as well, in which now it's just required to include the street address or tax map parcel number instead of all the description and everything
Okay.
to that point. So.
I've got one comment, one question, and I'll be done. My comment is I think the feds need to get involved in these charging stations. I mean, they're the ones that are pushing the initiative. I think they need to supply everybody with the charging stations it's going to take to keep up with all these electric cars that they're kind of insistent that we get on the road. And my last thing is, once again, you got to help me. I'm either not seeing the forest through the trees or just my brain's not comprehending the skinny bill and the education funding, to Councilman Rector's point. Supposedly there was a $2 million shortfall thereabouts is what the grocery tax would have generated. It was my understanding out of that $2 million, the school system did receive 9 payments of about $109,000. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I was told that the skinny bill would compensate for that initial $2 million. And I just need like a yes or no answer. You know, was the school system made whole in what they anticipated as far as the $2 million that was shortchanged from the original error in the grocery tax?
So I can't speak to a $2 million number or not, but what I can say is that all of the adjusted expenses that were evaluated and considered were reflected in the skinny budget that passed. So all of those adjustments between what was forecasted last year and what was actual for 2023 was adjusted and included in that additional investment in the skinny budget that was approved.
So I think my confusion is in the fiscal year 23-24, where if I'm confused, which it sounds like I am, that all the money was made whole for 23, but 24 is still out there.
There were adjustments made to 2024 already, because we are actually in 2024 now.
Right.
2024 began July 1. So the numbers, and we can confirm these numbers and get back to you, but the numbers based on our discussions with House Appropriations staff Monday, were that for FY 2023, the adjustment for sales tax distributions was 55 million and change, and the adjustments for 2024 were 63 million. And we can get, as I said, we can make sure, I know your finance team has numbers as well, we can make sure that you have the absolute latest and updated information.
If you could find out and get back with the manager so he can let us know, it's just,
Absolutely. I know it's a
something
sensitive
that's-
topic.
you know, it seems like it's hard to get definitive answers on where it is, and then we're rolling like from one year to the next year, but supposedly the skinny bill was going to close that gap and provide additional funding on top of it. So I just, I think myself and council just need to know exactly where we are.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that's it for me, not much. Anybody else have any other questions or comments from these two young ladies? No?
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Well, thank
It's
you
our
very
pleasure
much,
to-
and
to represent
thank you
the
for
city.
a great job. We did have a good year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our open session. We do have need for a closed meeting this evening, so I will ask our clerk to please present the motion for consideration.
Pursuant to Virginia Code Sections 2.2-3712A8 and A1, consultation with legal counsel employed by a public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the legal advice of such counsel, and the discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for appointment, and the assignment, appointment, and performance of specific public officers or appointees of the city, specifically the appointments as shown in the attached list for vacancies or term expirations for the Community Policy and Management Team, the Early Childhood Development Commission, the Economic Development Authority of the City of Suffolk, the Fine Arts Commission, the Historic Landmarks Commission, the Human Services Advisory Board, the Library Advisory Board, the Local Board of Building Code Appeals, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission, Planning Commission, Sister Cities Commission, the Suffolk Clean Community Commission, the Suffolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority, and the Tidewater Youth Services Commission. Item number 2, pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A3, the discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property for a public purpose or the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position and negotiating strategy of the public body, specifically tax map number 10*46, and pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A3, the discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property for a public purpose or of the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body, specifically tax map number 64A*T104 and 25*15.
Councilman Fawcett.
Move to approve, Mayor. Thank you.
Have a motion for approval from Councilman Fawcett. Councilman Rector.
Second.
Second from Councilman Rector. Is there any discussion of the motion? Hearing none, council members prepare to vote. Please cast your vote. Madam Clerk, please record the vote.
The motion is approved by a vote of 8-0.
That concludes our work session, and we will reconvene at 6 p.m.